Hey, you believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers, welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. This is a podcast where we welcome converts, but where we think like disciples, a show where we address things about which today's church is both terrified and silent. Hey, thank you, everyone. We just had our biggest week ever in the month of March. My heartfelt thanks to everyone who downloaded the show. And I want to welcome you to my 4th episode about the spiritual realm. I'm learning bushels and oodles. It's been an eye-opener to see how the ancient paleo sensitivity to the supernatural gets rehearsed and reprocessed later by the Old Testament and Jewish literature and Jesus and his apostles in the New Testament. And today's episode, giants and their demons. And no, I'm not going to psychoanalyze giants and how tormented their souls were. I won't explore the extent to which they worried, when I grow up, will I really be somebody? We will, however, explore what first Enoch said about giants and demons, and I want to set that up for you because a chunk of it gets carried into the New Testament. So glad to have you with me. And we here at the UU, we love, well, we means me. We love social media helps and loves. Recent unfriends who've shown me social media love, Victor S., Scott M., and Josh E. Donkin, my dudin. Well, the other day, it was on a Tuesday evening. In the course of 7 minutes, my knees began to tremble, my heart rate was pounding at 140 beats per minute, a cold sweat formed under my nostrils, my mouth dried up, a rash broke out in my armpits. Why? Watching TV, I had just heard the most terrifying words ever uttered in American history. That's right. During his State of the Union speech, Joe Biden said, "We're going to be okay." After I picked myself up off the floor, I hit the remote and played it back. We're going to be okay. Scaramouche. That's an alarming set of words. No, not because that precise assemblage of words are scary. No, it's chilling because middle-class Joe said it. Plagiarist Joe. He who, despite having been in politics since 1970. You mean 2017? No, 1970. Quid pro quo Joe, despite having had insider political info for 50 years, despite having access to Senate committee secret info, he who had access as the Vice President of the United States to classified information for 8 straight years, he, Slotchy, who has gotten every single thing wrong for his entire 5+ decade run, he just said, gulp, it's gonna be okay. Sleepy Joe, with the full force of the executive office, the only member of Obama's cadre to have voted against taking out Osama bin Laden. Can you even believe that? He, that Joe, just uttered aloud, "We're going to be okay." Now, if you haven't stowed away $7 worth of top ramen, this would be the time. If you haven't put a couple extra cans of beans on the shelf, today is the day. Because he, who has always been wrong, just said, "We're going to be okay." Lord, save Joe Biden's soul, and please have mercy on the United States. When he came down from Sinai, Mount Sinai, bummer report, my spiritual pilgrimage to Egypt got nixed. Maybe it's inflation, the ongoing concerns about COVID, or goodness, now war going on in Eastern Europe. I don't know, but the trip's off. I was so looking forward to climbing Mount Sinai. Anyway, when he came down from Sinai, Moses had a brilliant face. Here's what Exodus 34:29 through 30 says. Moses came down from Mount Sinai. As he came down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hand, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face was shining and they were afraid to come near him. Earlier in this series, I noted that the ancient world, those paleo cultures as I call them because they serve as the context for within which and against which the Bible was first written, the ancient world witnessed that divine beings were brilliant, illuminated, hot white, luminescent. The Nakash, remember him? The serpent himself was a physically brilliant figure, a member of God's heavenly divine council. And here we get all that echoed regarding Moses having spent time in the presence of God. The after effect? Moses' face shone brilliantly, so bright actually that for some time he had to veil his face when he went to be with the peeps. And that theme of shiny light and luminescence shows up in the New Testament. Here's one instance from Luke chapter 9. Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions saw his glory in the 2 men who stood with him. And just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. That sounds like me half the time, right? And while Peter was saying this, a cloud overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. So, knowing all that, maybe you, my razor-sharp listener, won't be surprised to know that the apostolic community, which means the eyewitnesses to Jesus, they believed, following biblical logic, the telos for God's own children, that we believers, in and through the resurrection, will also be glorified. Here's Paul in Romans 8. Those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he should be the firstborn among many brothers. Or here's Paul earlier in 2 Corinthians 3, verses 17 and 18. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, with unveiled face, reflecting the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory into glory, just as from the Lord the Spirit. And years later, the Apostle John would write when he was in Ephesus from 1 John 3:2, "We know that whenever he is revealed," he means at his second coming, "we will be like him, because we will see him just as he is." And man, if I read you the long chunk from Paul on the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, we'd see together that he very much expected us to be brilliant, luminescent, incorruptible after the resurrection, all after the pattern of the divine one incarnate himself, Jesus the Christ. Or goodness, if we went into the Revelation, we'd see that the resurrected will be handed white robes. That sense of light and luminescence just keeps repeating through the scriptures. And if you can believe it, this notion even shows up in pop culture. While I was working on this episode, listening to an old Paul McCartney and Wings album, his song Letting Go on the Venus and Mars album wrote, "Like a Lucifer, she'll always shine." Paul McCartney knew that first Enoch Genesis 6 reference, "Like a Lucifer, she'll always shine." You guys, the biblical influence on Western culture is immense. This luminescence insight is just one instance, though a relevant one, since I'm doing an entire series on the spiritual world, of how the Bible keeps repeating themes. Some ancient Torah verse gets picked up in the Psalms or again in the prophets, and then still later in newer Jewish apocryphal works, and then yet later in the New Testament's witness to the Nazarene. It's so fun, fascinating, all of it. The notion that divine beings are translucent or brilliant, bright white, and the notion that we will be, and the notion that the Bible, breathed by the Holy Spirit, the Lord Himself, keeps repeating those most ancient of themes, it's just delicious. And the more I read, especially in Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible, the more I keep seeing those ancient themes repeating themselves, even inside biblical passages that I thought I had sufficiently worked through. I feel a little embarrassed to have not seen these patterns before. But then, apparently, what happens with the Bible mirrors what I taught for years about Jesus Himself. I used to say, Christ is always what you think of Him and so much more. And like Jesus, the Bible just keeps wowing me with more. It's amazing. Earlier in that luminescent-esque reflection, I mentioned Jewish apocryphal literature. Today's show concerns a specific book of Jewish apocrypha, First Enoch, and its Second Temple Judaism worldview. But before I delve into Enoch per se, I gots to talk with you about apocryphal literature.
But Ed, if we Christians only study the Bible, then what's the point of splaining the apocalypse?
No.
What?
No, not the apocalypse, the apocrypha. And the answer? Because the Bible itself in the New Testament references the worldview at work in Jewish apocrypha. So understanding the apocrypha can help us better understand Jewish history, or better, in this instance, such study can better help us understand the New Testament itself. So, apocrypha, here's the definition. Literature where the integrity of authorship or the authority are doubtful. Specifically, there are Christian apocrypha. The Gospels of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, those were books written well after the time of the apostles, so their authorship is clearly dubious. For this series, we realize that there were Jewish history books written in the intertestamental period and which are in the Jewish Septuagint. And so, because the Septuagint was the earliest church's Bible, and honestly, all these apocryphal books are also in the Catholic Church's Bible today. Roman Catholic scholars sometimes call the apocryphal works deuterocanonical works or second-level authority books. Anyway, the point is, all of this is worth our consideration. Even much Protestant scholars see these books as insightful regarding understanding Second Temple Jewish history, again, the worldview inside the Judaism of Jesus' day. Okay, what is Second Temple Judaism? The Jewish ethos that developed after the nation of Israel's captivity into Babylon. And then, following that, the rebuilding of the Jewish temple as we find it described by Ezra and Nehemiah. Before and during this Second Temple phase, much of the Jewish community had turned to studying the Hebrew Bible. And this is the same era during which the rise of local synagogues developed among the Jews. And again, study of the Torah was central in their synagogues. So again, important for what we're doing here, there was a Jewish worldview at work during Second Temple Judaism, and we learn about that worldview in part from Jewish apocrypha. Oh, you guys, as an aside, part and just part of the split between Protestants and Catholics concerned which books should be included in the authoritative version of the Bible. Oh, and no, Jewish rabbis do not view the Jewish Apocrypha as inspired of God, which was a significant reason that Protestants also did not view the Jewish Apocrypha as inspired of God. But you guys, between the writing of the Old Testament and the New Testament, there were other documents written by Jews. And in this period, commonly known as the intertestamental period, the Holy Spirit is believed to have been quiet or silent as to inspiring authoritative literature. But that didn't keep Jewish authors and rabbis from writing. And one important for this series book written in that 400 period was First Enoch, First Enoch. Yes, of course, I'd be relighted in your $3 or $6 or $9 or your $14.70 a month pledge at Patreon. Go to Patreon, Patreon, make a pledge for the Uncensored Unprofessor. I would really appreciate that. Now, before I begin unearthing First Enoch, sometimes that E gets aspirated, Enoch, please know that Enoch is keenly aware of Genesis 6, 1 through 7, the passage I unearthed last week. Reflecting the Second Temple Jewish worldview, Enoch will show us what? 6 to 7 times more information about the sons of God. And all that is important for understanding of not only Jesus' historic context, but again for understanding the New Testament itself. Our Hebrew scholar Michael Heiser wrote, Second Temple Jews did not attempt to strip the supernatural elements from Genesis 6, rather they affirm them. First Enoch tells us that Enoch ascended into... Wait. Let me do still more necessary foundation laying, historical clarification for you. Enoch, which scholars believe began to first be written around 170 years before Christ, right, making it apocryphal since Enoch was gone centuries before, millennia before that potentially. But Enoch, a work of apocryphal Jewish literature, is comprised of 8 different segments from different periods in Jewish history. And it's the first segment, chapters 1 through 36, that concern us for this series. Now, the biblical Enoch, we recall from Genesis 5 variously, was A, the father of Methuselah, who lived to be 969 years old. And by the way, apparently, charting a path for all elderly folk across human history, Methuselah was the first to wear his polyester slacks pulled clear up to his nipples. He wore his clothes so long that they smelled of mothballs and urine, and Methuselah was so cranky that not only would he chase kids off his yard by yelling at them, he'd turn his artisanal well-fed lawn sprinklers on to make them scamper away. So Enoch is renowned for being the father of Methuselah. B, he's famous for having lived for 365 years. Isn't that amazing? He lives a year for each day in the annual cycle of days. Scholars are totally intrigued by that exact number, 365. And then C, especially pertinent for today's show, Enoch was a righteous man who walked with God, Genesis 5:22 and then again in 24. And instead of physically dying, Genesis says God took him and he was no more. Yeah. Being careful, we realize that, like the prophet Elijah in 2 Kings 2, who was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, that means he didn't die, Enoch went bodily into heaven and met with Elohim in the Hebrew. Did that mean he met with God or met with angels of the divine council? That's a good question. And one that's not only fascinating to imagine, it's critical for our understanding why the story of Enoch and the angelic watchers gets told the way it does. But whether he met with Yahweh or the sons of God on the heavenly council, Enoch did not die. He walked with God and went straight into heaven. He's an exceptional man for historic reasons, and that he went bodily into heaven is key, at least in the mentality of Enoch's author. And we should note too that this notion of heavenly ascent is one that transcends Jewish literature. Other paleocultures told ascent stories about men who ascended into the heavens, who went into the afterlife with their bodies. And later on, Plato wrote an ascent story, so did Cicero. And 20 centuries after them, so did Dante when he wrote the Divine Comedy, a story that still shapes Western conceptions of the afterlife. But there's just something that lures our imaginations about the idea of a live man walking among the gods. And again, we are noting First Enoch because the New Testament appeals to it, builds on it as an extension of Second Temple Jewish worldview. In fact, get this. Enoch was so righteous or so chosen of God that when he ascended into heaven, the watchers there asked him to intercede on their behalf. Wild stuff. Again, all of this is building on Genesis 6 verses 1 through 7, or building on Jewish traditions about Genesis 6, 1 through 7. Again, about the sin of sons of God coming down, having sex with beautiful women, and producing giants. Giants whose lineage corrupts, or has the potential to corrupt, the human race. We have those 7 verses in Genesis 6 that are taken and used by First Enoch to give us way more detail, more delineation. And you guys, my listeners, apocalyptic literature, apocryphal literature, always details more to and for us. That's the reason it was written. That's its focus. And First Enoch informs us that the primary sins of Genesis 6's sons of God was twofold. One of the angelic leaders named Asael is guilty of improper divine revelation. And again, we saw that part of the divine serpent's evil in Genesis 3 was to offer a corrupted oracle. Asael offered this bad divine revelation. It was false, corrupting, inappropriate knowledge, which is going to be translated from angels to human. And then B, led by still another top-tier angel named Shemaziah, the sons of God have sex with women and produce giants. Now, following all of this, these angels, these sons of God, ask righteous Enoch when he gets up into heaven, please seek God on our behalf. But chapter 14 of Enoch tells us that his intercession was rejected. The sons of God are too evil for even the prayers of righteous Enoch. So Genesis 6 gives us some information about these divine council members who come down and have sex with women. And we're going to see that same notion about council members is going to show up in Daniel 10 and in Deuteronomy 32:8, passages I haven't yet unpacked. Why haven't I done that? Well, you guys, I'm trying to unpack this for you in a chronological and orderly fashion. My insightful scholar Michael Heiser, he presents this whole spiritual and spiritualized worldview to you when you read him in an avalanche fashion. I mean, reading him is sort of like drinking from a fire hose. It comes at you fast and hard. And me, I'm trying to make this digestible, sequential, transferable across a podcast platform. And again, what's going on in Genesis 6 is taken up by First Enoch, and all of that worldview gets woven, and if you can believe it, appears in the New Testament. That makes it important. In fact, it's so important, I'm just going to read you some direct snippets from Enoch itself, and I'll make some commentary as we go. Here's First Enoch 6. And when the sons of men had multiplied in those days, beautiful and comely daughters were born to them. And the watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, come, let us choose for ourselves wives from these daughters of men, and let us beget for ourselves children. And Shemaziah, I said it wrong earlier. And Shemaziah, their chief, said to them, I fear that you will not want to do this deed, and I alone shall be guilty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and let us all bind one another with a curse, that none of us turn back from this counsel until we fulfill it and do this deed. Then they all swore together and bound one another with a curse, and they were, all of them, 200, who descended in the days of Jared onto the peak of Mount Hermon. And they called the mount Hermon because they swore and bound one another with a curse on it. And then chapter 6 continues by reciting the names of the 20 chief angels who led the 200 in this great sin, 20 leading each a group of 10. But you guys, my listeners, what we see here is that this was a community sin, a community abomination. While their leader was a single being, Shemahaza, even it was concerned that the others join in the horrid actions. And interestingly, we're not told that the leader was Lucifer, Satan. This by itself intrigues me. Isaiah 14:12, written some 700 years before Christ, touches upon a morning star, that means angelic being, who was cut down for its arrogance. We'll see later how Christianity sees Satan as the villain in Isaiah 14. But while that morning star was not then called the Satan, which is a Persian name, or not called Lucifer, a much later English name, that being in Isaiah 14 is clearly not Shemahaza. No, in Enoch we have a divine council, Archon, leader of 10, who itself leads a rebellion against the plans of God. Now that's something I've never considered. Well, not at least before I started researching for this series. An angelic son of God rebel who is not Satan, a leader of groups of other evil fallen beings who is not Satan, that's intriguing. But back to the text itself. Here's Enoch 7. These and all the others with them took wives for themselves from among them, such as they chose, and they began to go into them and to defile themselves through them, and to teach them sorcery and charms, and to reveal to them cutting of roots and plants. Was it wrong to do grafting? Was this some kind of forbidden horticulture that they were teaching them? And they conceived from them and bore to them great giants. And the giants begat Nephilim, and to the Nephilim were born Eliud. That what it's doing there is showing us there were successive generation of giants. And they were growing in accordance with their greatness. They were devouring the labor of all the sons of men, and men were not able to supply them. And the giants began to kill the men and to devour them. And they began to sin against the birds and beasts and creeping things and fish, and to devour one another's flesh. And they drank the blood, human sacrifice, clear abomination. Then the earth brought accusation against the lawless ones. End quote. That's Enoch 7. So, in that passage, you guys, we get much more other infos about sons of God, teaching human beings about magic, sorcery, the occult, the manipulation of reality. I wonder, was this the historic root for what the Apostle Paul will call pharmakia later in Galatians 5:20, a work of the fallen flesh? Pharmakia, which also gets translated as sorcery or witchcraft or drug use or idol worship. But the notion that manipulating reality through witchcraft and horoscopes, spells, amulets, statues, or more immediately through drugs was again being condemned here in Second Temple Judaism in 1st Enoch, some 160 years before Jesus walked the earth. And then, wow, giants were eating people? Drinking their blood?
That's gross.
That That sounds like the Greek legends of cyclopses who, on their deserted islands, captured and ate people. What's going on in those paleocultures' imaginations or understandings? Weird, evil, yucky. But let me continue with the text. Here's Enoch 8. Asael, one of the angelic archons, one of those leaders of tens, taught men to make swords of iron and weapons and shields and breastplates and every instrument of war. He showed them metals of the earth, and how they should work gold to fashion it suitably, and concerning silver, to fashion it for bracelets and ornaments for women. And he showed them concerning antimony, which means paint or eye paint or makeup, and possibly shining stones or jewelry. And he showed them about eye paint and all manner of precious stones and dyes. And the sons of men made for themselves and for their daughters, and they transgressed and led astray the holy ones. And there was much godlessness upon the earth, and they made their ways desolate. Shemi-Haza taught spells and the cutting of roots. Other archon, angels, those leaders of 10, taught men about spells and magic and skills and the signs of lightning flashes and signs of the stars, shooting stars, signs of the earth, signs of the sun, and signs of the moon, and they all began to reveal mysteries to their wives and children. And humankind, suffering so greatly from this heavenly wickedness, began to cry out to God. So we have Enoch here again unpacking and filling in all kinds of detail for us regarding Genesis 6. And hey, my ear-glued listener, I'm going to interrupt my reading of Enoch to remind you that Genesis 6 much more briefly tells us that the sons of God saw fair women and took wives for themselves, which produced the Nephilim, and that all that greatly displeased God, such that God planned to flood the earth and to wash out that wickedness. So Enoch, again, is providing us with more detailed information, info that prevailed inside a Second Temple Jewish worldview. And Enoch holds that there is a demonic quality, a demonic origin to the occult. And the same for making deadly instruments of war. Jesus, have mercy on Ukraine. And Enoch shows us that sexual lewdness, illicit sexuality, can be driven by fallen archonic, fallen demonic impulses. For me, now living 2,200 years after Enoch was written, much of that rings true. There is more going on inside human wickedness than simple fallen appetites and endeavors of human nature. Something wicked this way came. When, in my interpretive grid, when the sum is greater than the effect of the parts, we have to stop and ask, are we encountering demonic presences? And as I said at the end of number 2 in this series, I believe we are indeed encountering the power of demonic presences in our culture. Holy God, even inside the church. But let me keep reading pertinent clips from Enoch. Here's Enoch 9. 4 archangels in heaven, Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel, see the wickedness of the sons of God with women, and oracles of improper and wicked information, knowledge that leads to violence and warfare, knowledge that leads to inappropriate sexuality and pornography, illicit relations, occult-like practices of horoscopy and metallurgy, and ways, magic ways to control and manipulate reality? So these 4 good archangels, so overcome by the wickedness at work on earth, again, the Genesis 6 and other passages show us that heaven and earth are not so distinct, not so cut off from one another as our post-enlightenment worldview would have it. These 4 archangels approach God and appeal to Him for action and ask God what He wants them to do. And in Enoch 10, God responds, "Go to Noah and say to him in my name, hide yourself. And reveal to him that the end is coming and the whole earth will perish, and tell him that a deluge is about to come on the whole earth and destroy everything on the earth." So the 4 archangels go and do just as God commanded. And then The archangels, Enoch 10 and 11, also inform us. The archangels also round up the offending watchers, those sons of God, and bind them. And they are bound until the day of their judgment and consummation, until eternal judgment is consummated. Then they will be led away to the fiery abyss and to the torture and to the prison where they will be confined forever. And I'm going to discuss that stuff going on right there next week. And at the time of judgment, at which God himself will judge those watchers, they will perish for all generations. Destroy all the spirits of the half-breeds and the sons of the watchers, because they have wronged men. That's Enoch 10 and 11. And then still later in the book, our ascending man, Enoch, learns in a vision that, quote, from the dead bodies of the giants, evil spirits would arise. They would haunt mankind until the final judgment. End quote. I just got to say, goodness, that's quite a matzo ball you got there, George. Wow, what to say? Well, let me go to the end. Since I titled this episode Giants and Their Demons, let me reflect on what that just said in 1 Enoch 11. First Enoch teaches us that demons, it doesn't say some, all, come from dead giants, who when they die, their divine spirit is still here, it still remains and abides on the earth. And taking humanity as their special targets of anger and wrath, these demons seek to plague humankind. They clearly hate humanity, but woven to that, they also clearly hate God's aims for the human race. They mean to interrupt, if not destroy, God's plans for us. They don't want us to successfully represent God on earth, don't want us to fulfill our calling as imago Dei. They are our enemies and the enemies of God. And I know that Christians believe demons are the result of evil angels. I mean, Jesus in Matthew 25:41 said in his parable, "Depart from me, you wicked people, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." I mean, we learn there from Jesus that hellfire was created for wicked angels, wicked divine beings whom Jesus sees the devil as their leader. And frankly, we see Jesus affirming that ancient Genesis 6 worldview. There are, in fact, wicked angelic beings. We know from Ephesians 6:12 that our spiritual battle is against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. I mean, Paul is openly affirming the existence of divine beings who are themselves evil in that passage. But we don't get, not so specifically, the teaching that there are wicked demons who originally, or at one time in time, lived inside as giants. That's novel. Or I'm fairly certain that's novel for Christians. I mean, I've never heard pastors or believers talk that way in my life. And finally, for today, you guys, I want to tell you some personal reflections I have about Enoch. What do I personally think about what Enoch says about the spiritual world? Well, at the introductory angle, I find it fascinating. It builds off of Genesis 6, but it also weaves back in some of those ancient beliefs about divine beings sharing impure knowledge, oracles of abomination, that the Bible itself condemns. Another angle? I find it mesmerizing that supernatural beings' sin involved the allure of and sex with women. I mean, Genesis said that, but here Enoch says it in greater detail. And man, I think this angle alone could be its own particular podcast episode. I mean, we could ask historical, cultural, sociological, physical even questions. Yeah, some examples? Yeah, sure. Is this just a projection of ancient prudish fears about the power of feminine beauty? That women putting on makeup is a sin is still a tough concept for me. Admittedly, living in the now resolutely secular 21st century, it's a tough one for me to choke down. Or is this where the notion begins, misplaced as it is, that Eve was responsible for the fall of humanity? And we know it's misplaced because nowhere in the Bible does Eve get blamed. I mean, St. Paul doesn't blame Eve, he blames Adam. But does the serpent's, the Nakash's encounter with Eve itself get reimagined here in Enoch or over the centuries through Genesis 6, again back into Enoch? Sexification of the fall? There is. Much of that flows through monastic theology and Christian history. There's the belief that women are or can be too beautiful. And so they shouldn't do anything to draw attention to their beauty. And for me, among several critiques I can think of that perspective, it's a cancellation of God's own handiwork. Thank you, glorious God, for the beauty of women. What a gift to the entire planet. And more, and maybe it's because my oldest spiritual wiring runs back through Pentecostal software, which you should know means a heightened, holy, spiritual sensibility kind of software. But I actually can imagine that the spirits of giants still roam the earth, looking to wreak havoc, seeking out geographical domains they can pervert and dominate and corrupt. And then finally, again for me today anyway, I actually do believe that demons, corrupted divine beings, use pharmakia to make things more miserable in life. There are patterns of behavior where the sum is greater than the parts, the effects greater than the behavior itself. I see that in sweeping drug addictions, addictions that are woven through with cultural darkness, existential loneliness and darkness. Woven into that are corporate elements, both the professional and medical inside the United States elements, and the foreign drug cartels that exploit the beleaguered and the downtrodden. And I can see that in sexual pornography and sex trafficking and pedophilia, which is garnering increasing outspoken approval. I think we see it in the militant transgender movement, which means to totally dissemble human identity. All of those weave sticky webs of despoilment. They all have generational after effects that continue to wound on and on and on after the original actions. And all of that, it seems to me, is not hard to imagine how and that the demonic continues to savage human souls. Now, I don't think any of that necessitates demons having survived their physical existence in and as giants, but it doesn't seem impossible to me either. Oh goodness. Our time has run short. You know I treasure your interest. I want to thank you for listening. Next week I'm going to talk about how the Apkallu get thrown into Tartarus, which First Enoch here referenced. They get imprisoned, and how that's appealed to and quoted directly in the New Testament. You guys, thanks for listening. Please, everyone go and turn your beautiful God-given brains on.